Well, the problem with that is it leaves you nowhere, because if you don't have a uniting narrative, a uniting story, a uniting ethos, you don't have an explanation for your existence in the world, and you don't have a direction. And that's not helpful, because you can't live without an explanation for your existence in the world and a direction. Or if you do live under those conditions, you're bound to be miserable. And the reason you're bound to be miserable is because, and I would say that this is technically true, that almost all the positive emotion that you're going to experience in your life is a consequence of pursuing valuable goals. It's not a consequence of attaining them. It's a consequence of positing them, aiming at them, and then observing yourself moving towards them. And that the sense that accompanies that, and we know the neurobiology of this sense actually quite well, the sense of that is one of forward movement and engagement and meaning and accomplishment. It's something like that. Hope, that's another way of thinking about it. And it's the antidote in some sense to the flip side of life, which is the fact that it's nasty, brutish, and short, as Thomas Hobbes put it. And that's inalienable as well. There's no escape from the limitations and suffering of life. And so, in order for that not to become overwhelming, and then that can easily become overwhelming, and often does in people's lives, then you need a countervailing set of propositions that you can act out and embody to endow that limitation with worth. And that's not a trivial problem. He told me something I'd never thought about before at all. He was talking about the Christian passion, and he said that his sense was that the most important part of it was the scene, let's say, where Christ is crucified and cries out to God that he's been forsaken. And he said, look, got to think about what that means. I'm paraphrasing him. He said that the suffering that characterizes individual human life is so intense that even if God himself deigns to undergo it, it will test his faith to the point where he will not believe in his own existence. And that's really something. And I thought, wow, that's such a brilliant observation, is that, because it's definitely the case, if you interact with people in any manner that's the least bit below the surface, you find out that most people are carrying a relatively heavy existential burden of one form or another. Many people have a physical illness that they're dealing with, or a mental illness that they're dealing with. And if you're in a fortunate position where you're not dealing with either of those, you probably have a family member that does. And if you don't have either of those, you will. That's for sure. And that's just one of many terrible catastrophes that are certain to visit you. And that terrible catastrophe is a challenge to us in many ways. It's a challenge to us because it forces us to look deeply for a countervailing meaning that can make sense out of that, and then maybe more than make sense out of it. And so I've been curious about whether or not that countervailing meaning exists. It's like, well, why do we believe in the individual? The founders, the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence, it's not like they justified it, right? They said, we hold these truths as self-evident. It's like, that's not an argument. That's just a statement. It's like, and it's a statement like a game in some sense. It's like, well, let's assume these things are true and move on from there and see what happens. So the way Genesis is structured, it's quite interesting. There's 3 elements that are discussed as constituting the being. It's not a theory of material existence like a scientific theory. It's not that. It's a theory of being. So and that's a hard thing to understand in itself. You can think about it as a theory of the structure of experience. That's another way of thinking about it. You have experience of the world, and you have your emotions and your motivations, and You have your aims and your stories and your thoughts. There's a characteristic human mode of existence. It's conscious. We're aware that things exist. And we live within that structure. And as far as I can tell, given that Genesis is certainly not a scientific account of the structure of the universe, it has to be some account of something else. And it's an account of experience itself. And maybe experience itself is the ultimate reality. And it depends to some degree on how you define ultimate. It depends also on how you define reality. But you can play that game. You can say, well, let's assume that that your experience is reality. It's certainly reality as far as you're concerned. I mean, especially, and I would say one of the things about that make that self-evident is pain. Like, there's nothing like pain to convince you that your experience is real. I don't know anyone who isn't convinced that their experience is real by pain. And the only people I know that might be unconvinced just haven't had enough pain. Because if they did, they'd be convinced. There's no arguing it away. Here we are in this being that's being constructed in this reality, and it's very difficult reality. Human beings are for us, our lives are bounded and limited. We're mortal. We suffer. And if we suffer enough, injustice, or justice even sometimes, if we suffer enough, it's very easy for us to turn against being and to curse it. And it's not surprising, and this is why Zizek's words hit me so hard, because when he said that suffering could become so intense that even God himself would have doubts about the benevolence of himself, in some sense. That's what that moment means on the cross. It's like, well, what in the world would you expect from mere human beings? What, you don't know much, and you don't know much, and neither do you. Like, we're full of biases and blind spots, and even when you're trying to formulate your thoughts clearly, you're not that good at it, especially if you're thinking about something complex and chaotic and unknown. And you're gonna have to stumble around madly and make all sorts of mistakes to make any progress at all. And with any luck, you'll be able to talk to other people, and they'll be just as clueless about it as you, but out of that dialogical process, if you're actually trying to communicate, something approximating the truth will emerge, and hopefully the truth will set us free as it's supposed to and put us on the proper path.